We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to eradicating human slavery, human trafficking, child exploitation, and child sexual abuse material through disrupting networks and applying data, technology, and advanced analytics and intelligence.
Welcome, everyone. This panel is titled Bank-Led Efforts Around Anti-Human Trafficking in Child Sexual Abuse Material. I'm Sarah Byrne, your moderator, and I'm an attorney with Morin Van Allen in Charlotte, North Carolina on the Financial Regulatory Advice and Response team. And through that work, I represent victims of human trafficking and I help financial institutions build anti-trafficking programs. Joining me today are the following esteemed panelists. First up, we have Nicole Katowski with Associated Bank in Wisconsin. During her 30-year tenure at Associated Bank, Nicole has held leadership roles in consumer banking, technology, and corporate risk. Currently, as Chief Risk Officer, she's responsible for all areas of enterprise and operational risk, advancing the use of tech and data within BSA, fraud, investigations, cyber, and physical security in the identification and prevention of financial crimes. Next, from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, we have Sean Marston, who is a Senior Vice President and Deputy Director within the Financial Intelligence Unit at Truist. With 20 years of banking experience, Sean leads the Credit Specialist Group, which is primarily responsible for conducting risk-based anti-money laundering due diligence on prospective and existing clients seeking commercial credit and other banking-related services. Dialing in from Western New York is Kim Spider, who is a Vice President and BSA Compliance Manager within M&T Bank's Financial Investigations Unit. Kim also manages the Financial Investigations Unit Training and Strategy team. She's had multiple roles at M&T, including FINRA Registered Sales Principal and Securities Compliance Manager, Senior BSA Investigator, and Investigations and Targeted Analytics Manager and Training Manager. Also from Western New York and M&T Bank, we have Mike Ripley, who is a Vice President and BSA Compliance Manager in the bank's Analytics Working Group within the BSA AML Financial Investigations Unit. He also has held multiple roles, including Senior BSA Investigator, and most recently managing the Targeted Analytics team within the Financial Investigations Unit. Mike's focus over the last 2 years has been COVID-19 pandemic relief fraud and human trafficking and CSAM. Lastly, we welcome Steve Zinger, who is a Vice President and Manager of the Risk and Targeting Group within the AML Model Support and Analytics Department at PNC. Steve has held senior management positions in the AML Compliance Operations Group, and since 2019, he has been in the AML, BSA, and Sanctions program. His current focus is on improving the effectiveness and efficiency of the behavior detection applications while ensuring the applications within PNC's risk profile. So, needless to say, this panel is rich with Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering experience, and they all work directly with detection of human trafficking and child sexual abuse material. As we all know, these financial crimes are really important matters of regulatory compliance for banks. So we're thrilled to convene this panel today. It's really an important matter of regulatory compliance, as we see from several indicators. In October 2020, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network of the U.S. Department of Treasury released its supplemental advisory on identifying and reporting human trafficking and related activity. The AMLA Act of 2020 required that the GAO conduct studies and report on, among other things, the role that emerging technologies can play in assisting with and potentially enabling the laundering of proceeds from trafficking. In 2021, the OCC and other agencies issued an interagency statement explaining the new national priorities for AML CFT, which included human trafficking as one of those 8 priorities. Also in 2021, FinCEN released a notice calling attention to online sexual exploitation crimes. So let's go ahead and hear from the experts on how to heed these calls and the regulatory obligations. I'll start, Nicole, with you. Would you mind kicking this off and giving us an overview of what you see as the modern approach or even the new frontier for financial crimes transaction monitoring and analytics in order to specifically detect human trafficking and child sexual abuse material?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. So happy to be here on this important topic. I think that there's just so many elements of monitoring, many of which are, I think, traditional, some of which are new, and all of which we're continuing to look at. There is no status quo. I don't think the work is ever done. So it's a constant evolution. One thing is for certain, it really needs to be a multifaceted approach. It's important that the ongoing communication trends, red flags are put forth out across the institution for referrals. Although that's not specific to data monitoring, it's vital in a multifaceted approach in trying to identify all of the various avenues where we may be able to detect activity. I would say that in general, and I've heard this across our peer group, is it's very tough activity to detect with modern and traditional rules. The reason being, a lot of times the dollar amounts and volumes, non-international in nature, don't flag for some of the more traditional types of monitoring. So we do have to get creative. And we have looked at several rules that we've adjusted and put in and really have changed throughout the course of the last several years. Some places that we've seen some ongoing success is looking at geographies and ATM transactions or branch activity, even at low dollar amounts. If you're in 4 or 5, 6 different geographies in short periods of time, anomalous activity to what a customer would normally do, even if they're not hitting international flags or they're not hitting high dollars or even high volumes that may hit some of those other rules. Another thing that we have found helpful, and this really continues to grow strength with working with your peer group, and that's keyword searches, looking and interrogating the descriptions and the sources of all transactions in places, especially where human trafficking victims may be peddled. So Backpage, Model Mayhem, Inmate Canteen, and there's just dozens out there that we've added to our list. It continues to grow based off of feedback. We've gone so far as to put Craigslist out there just so that it gets eyes on if there's any other types of activities that would be synonymous with red flags. So with that, we do a lot of the others that I think are very normal: multiple cell phones, hotels, Ubers, lots of large fast food, all of these things being not in and of themselves a flag, but in you look at the whole big picture, could come to the surface. So those are the rules that we've looked at. It really has been an exercise in large amounts of data migration, anomaly detection, and fine tuning for the false alerts. The final comment I'd really make in this space is the peer network. Leveraging other financial institutions and what's worked for them has been instrumental. And this is a place where I think we all have to work together to share best practices, continue to look at the keywords, and make sure that we're covering this from as many angles as possible.
Thank you, Nicole. You really well said that there are unique challenges with detecting these two particular crimes. So with those unique challenges, we need innovative approaches. So I wondered, Steve and Mike, could you each just talk to us very briefly about recent initiatives that you and your organizations have been involved in that have yielded significant results in detecting the financial crime, specifically with CSAM and human trafficking? So for example, Steve, perhaps you could talk about the Noble, and then Mike, perhaps you could mention Project Umbra.
Yeah, sure. So most recently with the Super Bowl, the Noble was able to stand up an initiative with 30 plus financial institutions and partner with law enforcement on various levels to target human trafficking around the large event of the Super Bowl in Los Angeles this past year, specifically in February. I've heard about these initiatives in the past and was lucky enough to be involved in this one. We were successful in partnering with the Noble and sharing techniques to identify variables that could be specific to the Los Angeles area around SoFi Stadium. Really tried to target in on the human trafficking that would be happening during that time. As a PNC, we were very successful in identifying several cases, not all of them human trafficking related, which was a little bonus that we had on the side. And we're able to get a lot of data to help us enhance our existing scenarios that exist for the run-of-the-mill scenarios that we run. We had some good success with identifying new variables that we want to include in our existing scenarios. So We're trying to identify how to use peer-to-peer information, get some more data to help us identify which ones we want to look at. Some of the challenges we had to overcome, for example, hotels.com was something we wanted to key in on, or something where hotels are being used. Yeah, you don't have location data for those. So if you're doing a specific targeted scenario for an event, we had to get creative and identify how could we really pinpoint where someone was. How do we know if they're getting multiple hotels in the same area? Some of the variables we all know could be part of the human trafficking network. So I got to say, my biggest experience with this is trying to get our data quality to the point where we're able to use it and utilize it in a way that's effective. So I think we had some really good results. I know the Noble is planning on doing some initiatives in the future. And I feel like this will be a nice, easy up and lift our scenario to the next event, see what kind of impact we can have.
Everybody. M&T Bank is participating in Project Umbra, which is a collaborative effort to identify indicators to identify and reduce child sexual exploitation. So this project has also leveraged the Noble Group to form a collaboration between financial institutions, regulators, NGOs, and law enforcement. So through this process, we were able to work together with the group to learn about red flags associated with CSAM. So this could be intel about typologies, to trainings on specific trends, areas of concerns, as well as conversations with law enforcement to speak about things to look for, activity to search for, and different trends that could be indicative of child sexual abuse material. So one of the added benefits of working in that collaborative environment is that we're going through this together. So if one financial institution discovers something that works, they can then share that with the other financial institutions to make all our processes better. So through that collaboration, we would share processes that worked, that didn't work, and it made us all better in the long run. So this is such a difficult topic to either identify or classify, but working together as that collaborative, as well as getting that direct intel from law enforcement, had a significant positive impact on identifying suspicious activity or identifying targeted analytics. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. What we're hearing is innovation and collaboration is really the new frontier in this space with regard to these really challenging financial crimes to detect. So we've been mostly talking about identifying, or at least modeling perhaps individual transactions among individuals. We talk about peer-to-peer. But Sean, I wondered what you're seeing by way of advancement in performing risk due diligence for commercial and organizational clients, and how that might fit into the bank's risk profile and tolerance.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for having me on the panel. I think, the biggest thing, or the biggest advancement in the space that we're seeing is just this general awareness of the issue today. And so when I think about that, our frontline staff, we're doing a lot more training. There's a lot of the computer-based training. I know, the ABA has the trafficking and smuggling coursework. Within the FIU, we're doing more red flag training. I know ATII has a bunch of good flyers out there that, you can use and train and have that investigator, have that up in their cube or where they're working when they're running investigations. We recently also established our task force on this. And so it's allowed us to really, partner with organizations like yourself and Polaris, really around some of the other panelists have talked about that information sharing and the ongoing education. But, to specifically answer your question, at Truist, especially with our commercial portfolios, we're not only looking at the clients at onboarding, but we're looking at the clients when they have that commercial transaction. And the reason we're doing that, and the reason that my group was ultimately stood up a few years ago, is that we realized there is just this vast amount of KYC data that is held with the frontline staff. And it's almost this constant update as well. When they're calling on their clients, they know the BO, they know the CP, they understand the transactions, they understand how the client operates. And so by teaching them on the front end how to recognize, this typology, when they come to our group for that kind of sign off on their transaction, they're really answering a series of risk-based questions, which helps us drive our investigation. And so we're looking at, as Nicole mentioned, those higher risk industries, where our footprint is up and down the East Coast and in Texas. So we have a bunch of agriculture, and you're looking at those high labor industries, the hotels, the motels. But what's kind of cool to do is that, they're trying to get a loan approved. So they're doing a bunch of financial analysis, and they're comparing their company. You're looking at profitability and certain margins. Well, there are, we use this, it's called RMA statement studies. And it basically takes, it's 100,000+ different like small and medium-sized businesses that have all their financials compiled based on industry type, based on NAICS code, and it common sizes the data. So if you're comparing your client's profitability, say they're a potato farmer and they're at 15%, where the industry is typically at 3%, that might be a place where the investigator digs into those financials to see, okay, are they actually reporting the payroll expenses? Are they, what is missing from this? And they take that information when they're going into the back end systems and looking at anything that may have alerted. And one of the nice things is it will, it'll either validate what they're seeing that we may have, filed on in the past, or it will actually clear it up. And so that's what we're kind of doing in the commercial space. From the task force perspective, we are doing a bunch of back end projects. So, we've screened our commercial portfolio against some of these open source intelligence packets that, nonprofits have, and we'll use those as a jumping off point for a deeper dive. A couple other things we've done, we've looked at parties that share a common address. So like 5-6 parties at the same address. Well, why? I mean, it may be legit, but it may not, kind of screening that. The one thing I would say, and this is a project we ran last year where we had quite a bit of success. It was a general idea to take the bank card portfolio for both our retail and commercial clients and run them against certain merchant category codes. And so that's what the vendor, how they describe the transaction. And so, we were looking at the typical stuff, the hotels, the motels, the fast food, the Ubers, and you get, you talk about trying to set alerts and scenarios. We just ended up with like so many hits, like unworkable number, like hundreds of thousands. And we were able to actually get a listing, and I guess I'll give them a shout out from Polaris of these commercial sex advertising sites. And so we took that in the background and ran the keyword searches along with those other qualifying red flags, and we're really able to get to a decent population to review. And it's kind of sickening a little bit, like the number of people that may, swipe their card or run these transactions. But it did allow us, in my opinion, to get some bad actors, out of the bank. And, we've been merging for the past 2 years to become Truist. So, our ultimate goal is, once we get all the system integration complete, is to take this information and try and build some better, alerting scenarios. So it's really specific to that trafficking typology. But that's what we're doing. I hope I answered your question.
You did, and I'm encouraged to hear the effectiveness of the partnership with NGOs like Polaris, an extraordinary organization that has a lot of materials that can really help, in the financial crime space. So thanks for sharing that. And you'd mentioned training. And I actually, Kim, I'm going to put you on the spot. You manage all the training in this space for M&T. Will you talk to us about training people and not machines, which we've generally been talking about machines, but what topical areas does your training focus on, and really who is your target audience?
Yeah, so thank you. And to your point, not machine learning, we're talking people learning, because just as important as it is to try to create rules-based scenarios in analytics to identify the information and the transactions that are indicative of human trafficking in CSAM, it's just as important and crucial to train. And the population of the individuals we're training is not just the financial investigations unit or BSA staff. Really, it starts frontline. It's important for our lines of business and risk partners on the line of business ends to know and understand what to look for as far as not only transactional red flags, but behavioral red flags. And we've found that with educating not only our financial investigations and fraud units, but also our frontline business partners, that it ends up with results of phenomenal referrals leading to effective SAR filings. And so what our stance is in training is that we take all of the experiences and the knowledge that we learn from our multidimensional approaches, as Nicole had mentioned. It's a collaborative effort, and you have to have a multifaceted approach when attacking this, right? So we use the knowledge that we use from our involvement with Project Umbra, as well as roundtable discussions. We have a strong relationship with law enforcement, and they provide us with current, real, and relative, I should say, trends, typologies, things that we can relate to as we're describing these red flags to our investigators. With all that information, we're able to compile that into a comprehensive training. So with that training, we cover not only the regular definitions and red flags transactionally, but we're also covering global statistics. We have impact stories from victims, and law enforcement actually partners with us to conduct these training sessions and shares case studies that have occurred in and around our region. And so the invitation is out for not only our financial investigations unit, but to our lines of business, so they can see from start to finish how they can identify and help victims and keep our communities safe. The other thing I wanted to mention, of course, and I talk about the collaboration efforts, and this has been brought up multiple times by, I think, everybody here. It's the partnerships, our peer partnerships, the law enforcement partnerships. This has got to be a community effort. So education is not just internal. It's sharing what we've learned and whether our challenges, our mistakes, and our strengths with our peers, as well as internally with our bank. So.
Thank you, Kim. I kind of want to stick with the law enforcement and SARS process. Nicole, I'd be interested to hear from you. Now that human trafficking and somewhat CSAM are addressed in the SARS process, will you talk a little bit about reporting either through the SARS process or outside of it? And that stands for suspicious activity reports for the audience. But really what you see as most effective from a law enforcement response. Kim had talked about having open communication and hearing case studies back from them and what was effective. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that how to get your point across in a SAR is a topic that, many financial institutions spend time with in their investigative units. It's really an important part. And I think that human trafficking SARs really are no different, except for the fact that they're probably one of the more egregious things we're filing, as we want to make sure that they are certainly the most effective and clear. So a lot of the things that I'll state are just kind of the best practice of SAR filings, clear and concise summary, making sure that you've got all of the relevant information, that you're checking the box that you expect human trafficking. We actually brought in a member of the human trafficking task force to talk to our investigators. to give us firsthand, when you're looking at a SAR, what are you looking for? What are you reading? And one of the things that they've said in all of it is in the first couple of sentences, you need to grab their attention. You need to tell them what you think it is and why, in as few words as possible, as bluntly as possible. Those are the ones that grab attention, obviously. We also, and it's been now said, I think, really well about those partnerships and relationships. We have relationships with local law enforcement, the Human Trafficking Task Force, and other law enforcement agencies. And when we see something that's particularly alarming, we will reach out. We make proactive calls to say, this SAR is coming. We think you should pay attention. We're at the ready to help however we can. So we don't just wait for them to call us. We also call them and have built what I think is mutual trust and respect and rapport as we all are working at the same purpose to get the bad guys off the street.
Thank you. So that's a plug for good and concise writing skills and a follow-up phone call to law enforcement. So we've focused a bit more on trafficking. I want to shift to child sexual abuse material. And, as I sort of mentioned, there is a checkbox for HT on the SARs, but for now, it's an other for CSAM as I understand it. Mike, can you speak to the distinct red flags and how detecting child sexual abuse material is different than when we're looking for, human trafficking, forced labor, or commercial sex?
Absolutely. So first off, there's definitely a crossover between CSAM and human trafficking, but there is also a large element to CSAM. So in our conversations with law enforcement, as well as our work with Project Umbra, we learned about a few different typologies. So first to understand the red flags, we got to understand the typologies. So by learning about the typologies, you can then apply analytics or transaction behaviors to identify that suspicious activity. So with the pandemic and growing access worldwide to the internet, CSAM has becoming an increasingly bigger issue. So a lot of our focus has been on online behaviors or transactional behaviors tied to the internet. So some of what we've learned is there are CSAM networks online and various video chat programs, message boards, or social media platforms where members trade and collect CSAM material. Oftentimes, the entry fee is CSAM material, almost like it's acted as a currency itself. So that's a large part of what CSAM is, but we also see situations where perpetrators solicit minors on social media, gaming platforms, or online message boards to either groom or obtain CSAM material. So oftentimes the perpetrators will give gifts, they'll give money, or they'll even give virtual currency to video game platforms to the minor. So another growing trend that we're seeing right now is sextortion. So sextortion comes in a couple different forms. So it could target adults. So in the scenario where it's targeting adults, it's like it's where the perpetrator will extort the adults, saying that if they don't pay them, they'll tell all their family. So the victim that will pay the funds in order for that information not to be released. But with minors, they'll be extorted either to produce CSAM material or to pay the perpetrator in order to avoid having the victim's family members know of the activity. So oftentimes the perpetrator in these scenarios will be paid by either P2P, crypto, or via money transfer businesses. So we've also seen situations of production, distribution, and selling of CSAM material. Again, like when I'm going through this, think about all the various situations and how there's unique red flags to each of these scenarios. And finally, the last scenario that we've seen is victims self-producing material and then circulating it online. It could be for financial benefit. It could be for other reasons as well. So to kind of wrap this up, knowing these trends can help you when you're building out your analytics programs or educating your staff to identify this behavior. So some red flags that people can look for are the usage of online anonymizers, cloud storage, online encryption services, basically just to disguise online presence. Payments at youth-oriented chat rooms, video streaming websites, or the usage of P2P or money transfer businesses. Another key indicator could be money transfers, transactions, or sending of money to individuals in high-risk jurisdictions. And then finally, another key indicator is negative news associated with an individual to child sexual exploitation. So oftentimes you'll see people with that background have potential concerning activity related to the online CSAM activity. But yeah, knowing the trends will help you in identifying the activity.
Thank you, Mike. Recommendation. It's really daunting that you all have to monitor for so many new forms of currency and behaviors. So thank you for that important work and those recommendations. So we have focused a lot on sexual exploitation. So we may be remiss in not addressing the challenges with detecting forced labor. And Sean, you talked a little bit about this when we talked about organizational clients and maybe particular industries that are high risk for forced labor. But Steve, I wondered if you would speak a little bit to the, in the industry, we just talked about the continued challenges with identifying instances of forced labor. What, in your mind, would help improve detection of this form of trafficking?
So this is a real hot topic. Of course, PNC recently acquired some branches along the southwest border in an area that we aren't traditionally in the past. So this has been a hot topic for us to work through ourselves personally as well. I think the challenge I identify, and I'm sure others may have other opinions on this that may help, but forced labor sometimes can just look very similar to transient migrant workers coming across the border in some cases and other situations. So I think the way they perform their transactions, being cash primarily, sending funds back home, some of these things may look similar to a forced labor situation. So I kind of get around to the point of we need to have some reliance on human intelligence. You need to have someone on the front line that is identifying something that's unusual, someone who is maybe bringing external information that's not data driven. As much as I love data, I think there's got to be that human element to bringing some of those things. So going back to what Kim talked about training and some of those other important things, the training can't just stop with the investigations team. You need to get your frontline tellers, call center employees, things like that, aware of what's happening. Some of the things that we're working on to try to identify better forced labor, I think it is imperative to identify the ultimate beneficial owners. They may not be the beneficial owners on the sense of what we're capturing for KYC, but there is a source of funds going to funnel to someone who's eventually in charge of these organizations and running them and organizing them. So we're trying to apply some graph analytics techniques to help us to better see where the funds are moving once they're coming into accounts. And that'll identify the people running those organizations, and that may lead us to who the victims are and how to handle those. These investigations, I know it's a challenge to even work through our investigations with the suspicious activity reports given a normal day. I think these investigations require a dedicated amount of time to really focus on little aspects of the case that aren't the typical human trafficking or CSAM type scam, and really kind of takes a little bit of a investigative hound to really dig into where things are moving and how they're working. And just, as I think through these, I just think external data applied to our data is really going to be a key piece to all of these situations. Screen scrapes from external websites. We've talked about some of the ones. I know, Nicole, I think you mentioned that. Having advertisements that we can look at with names, emails, phone numbers, apply those to our customer bases. Same thing with these types of businesses too. You may see some odd advertising that draws people into the businesses. But I think as an industry in the financial institutions, forced labor is the next step or opportunity I think we all have to get better at. It's really easy to find the sexual exploitation, I think. But to find the forced labor, it takes it to another level.
Thank you, Steve. So we've mentioned, using outside sources to integrate within our systems. And we talked about partnership with NGOs. I know among the NGO community, there is often the discussion of maybe financial institutions having to experience false positives. We've already talked about how complicated it is to put typologies together that will effectively identify any of these crimes that we're talking about. But would anyone be willing to speak to the risk of our systems erroneously detecting or flagging or even exiting accounts of persons who may not be perpetrators, but may be victims, but their behavior may present as a perpetrator? And any thoughts on how do we minimize those risks or otherwise address that?
I can tell you I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think that's a hard question that institutions struggle with all the time. We've kind of taken the stance that if the activity presents itself where it looks like they are perhaps a perpetrator, in the back of your head, you know that there is a possibility that they're a victim, and the hope is that in filing that SAR that it's picked up, and that if it's looked at, if that's a victim, then maybe they're getting helped out by that. They're getting pulled out of that situation. And if it's a perpetrator, hopefully the law enforcement's able to take it and go down the rabbit hole with it to kind of uncover that network. But it's so hard to tell because you've got this requirement to file. Now the exit decision, that's a tough one because you obviously don't want that activity occurring at your institution. So that's what we look at.
Yeah. Sean, I kind of echo what you're saying as well. It is a very difficult scenario. First and foremost, as far as false positives go, what I really stress in training and continuing education for our investigators is that one red flag does not mean that there's imminent criminal activity. And so it's important to identify a pattern, and whether that be the combination of negative media as well as activity or patterns of activity. SAR filing is our regulatory requirement. So, it's difficult to know if they're a willing participant or an unwilling participant. Either way, if we see activity that is deemed suspicious, we should be filing a suspicious activity report. As far as exiting customer accounts, again, I go back to partnerships with law enforcement. If we feel that there is potential for human trafficking or CSAM, we partner with our law enforcement contacts. We bring it to their attention. Certainly, if we can't make a determination, we do typically err on the conservative side and de-risk the customer by exiting the relationship. But the bank does, retain the right to potentially reevaluate that exit decision. So if it's deemed that the customer is in fact a victim, we will, reevaluate and allow them to continue a relationship with the bank.
Sarah, if I can add maybe a different take on this a little bit too, from a data side, I think a false positive, and I'm talking a true false positive, not necessarily someone who's a victim, can be just as valuable to me in a tuning aspect as a true positive. Okay, that's where we need to adjust. That's where it's okay. I always use the example, I'm quite a few years out of college right now, so I don't know what college kids do nowadays. And sometimes I look at the activity and I think, well, I would have never have done that, or I wouldn't have had the money to do that, or whatever. But that doesn't mean that that's not what the norm is today. And the same thing can happen with these. So, it's easy for me to sit and set variables and look at things and look at the data. But when we have false positives that are clogging up our systems, we should be using that data to better go back and refine, I think.
And that's a good point, Steve, because from an analytics standpoint, ultimately, when we build our targeted analytics, we often do have what's considered false positives as well in the data. We need to go back and refine the data. So I believe, Sarah, you might have been intending to talk about when, we believe that there's suspicious activity and that the customer is a suspect when in fact they may be a victim. But it's a very good point, Steve, as well, that as we're going through these different approaches with analytics and data, that we're refining we're reviewing the results and refining that data to make sure that we're getting the best pinpointed results.
So you'll forever, adjusting and tweaking the dial and applying the human eye, to all processes and learning from each other, peer-to-peer in the community and with NGOs and law enforcement through training and other collaborations. So these are all great recommendations. Is there anything anyone else wants, before we only have a few more minutes, wants to offer, comment on anything we didn't touch on that's really important for this audience to hear?
I guess I would wrap up to say, I think, we covered quite a bit on the monitoring side, but one of the questions I get asked the most as I go out and speak to the bank and community is, what else can we do? Because people feel helpless in this space. And I would say there's a lot of things, even if you're not directly associated in these roles or positions, to self-educate, to be part of the community, to pay attention, to set up discussions. And there's a lot of volunteer opportunities, domestic violence shelters and things like that. So collaboration and partnership, I think, goes beyond financial institutions. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks to get involved in meaningful ways.
Nicole, I'm so glad that you said that. And I'll mention another effort that I'm certain a lot of the audience is familiar with, but the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, which is a finance against slavery and trafficking initiative where banks offer banking products and services to victims of human trafficking who might not otherwise be eligible for those products and services, whether it's due to credit history or not having a beginning balance funds or just other barriers identification. So while there may be a risk of misidentification, but that's obviously well dealt with at the banks, but there are other bank-led efforts that we can engage in to support victims of this crime. Kim, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, actually, I'm agreeing full-heartedly. And there's different, especially with domestic abuse, which often is related to trafficking, involvement, community involvement, which our bank strongly supports. In addition, it's providing resources to those or links to resources, right? Not only educating them on how to identify it, but also letting them know if they are personally affected. Or they know somebody who's personally affected, how they can help.
I think if I had one takeaway for the audience, it'd probably be directed at those folks that are listening on the call and thinking, well, shoot, my financial institution isn't doing any of this that I'm aware of. We don't ever hear about that. And I would simply encourage those individuals to, stand up and step up and get engaged with, folks like yourself and Polaris and these other organizations and get the ball rolling, because it's happening at your organization. It's just you haven't found it yet. And so, starting today is the best thing to do, especially if nobody's doing anything. Be that leader and move forward with a project at your bank. So.
Those are great parting words. So we move from sort of high-tech typologies and machine learning and all of that to people, whether it's training people or having relationships in the communities, to these community efforts and engaging those who may be excluded from the financial industry and NGOs that support this population to really have a larger impact through bank-led efforts. So as mentioned, financial sector responses to human trafficking and CSAM are an emerging focus for regulatory compliance. So this has been a really important discussion, and we thank the Anti-Trafficking Intelligence Initiative for the platform to share these ideas on how the financial sector can meet and even exceed their obligations to better combat these very harmful crimes. And thank you to our extraordinary panelists for their expertise and for the audience for joining us today. So until next time, thank you.